Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Good afternoon, and welcome to WCAT Radio and this edition of Inter Vitam et Mortem, Between Life and Death, interviews and discussion with a Catholic bioethicist. I am your host, Dr. Mary Anne Urlakis. I am a classically trained and degreed bioethicist, and today I have with me a distinguished guest, renowned scholar, Dr. Al Kertz, to talk about the relationship between science and faith. Before we begin, let's start like we always do with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Dear God, our Heavenly Creator, you are the author of life and of truth, the reality that you will each and every human person into being, created from the moment of conception, bearing the dignity and imprint of your own image and likeness within the very essence of our being, is a mystery beyond human understanding. Please help us to have a greater appreciation, the gift of being created in your image and likeness. Help us to reverence this reality in our brothers and sisters, especially in the tiniest and most vulnerable among them. Help us to defend the sanctity of every human life from conception to natural death, through the intercession of Our Lady, the ever-pure and all-immaculate Blessed Virgin Mary, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Again, thank you for tuning into this episode of WCAT Radio's Inter Vitam et Mortem, Between Life and Death, discussion and interviews with a Catholic bioethicist. Today I have the privilege of speaking with Dr. Al Kertz. Dr. Kertz is the principal at ANDHIL, it's a LLC. He's an expert in nutrition, feeding, and management of dairy cattle. Dr. Kertz earned his doctorate from Cornell University in animal nutrition. His expertise has led him to numerous positions of leadership within the American Dairy Association, way too many awards and distinctions to mention. Dr. Kertz's career includes highly sought-after consulting work, not only in this country, in the dairy industry, but also throughout the world: Canada, Mexico, Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, Venezuela, Spain, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Romania, South Korea, China, Russia. It is with Dr. Kertz's distinguished background as a scholar, a scientist, an expert in the dairy industry, and as a Magisterium-faithful Catholic that I have invited him to join us today to talk about the relationship between science and faith. Welcome, Dr. Kertz. I'm delighted that you were able to accept my invitation to be a guest on this program. And could you tell the Inter Vitam et Mortem audience a bit about yourself?
Well, thank you, Mary Anne, for the opportunity. I grew up on a small dairy farm about an hour south of St. Louis, Missouri. I'm the middle of 7 children. My parents are simply the wisest, most humble, faith-filled people I have known. Their education stopped at the end of 8th grade, but they always felt that it was our responsibility to develop our God-given talents, not only for our benefit, for that of others. And so they placed a premium on education. I went to St. Agnes School in Bloomsdale, Missouri. It was a mile from where I lived. Went to high school at Valley Catholic High School in St. Genevieve, Missouri. My parents made quite a personal and financial sacrifice to pay our way through high school, through a Catholic high school. It was that important for them. And then, as you mentioned, I went on to the University of Missouri. I did undergraduate and master's degrees there in dairy. My older brother had been there and graduated. All of my siblings graduated except one from college, several with master's degrees. I was very blessed at the university to have a professor, a relatively young assistant professor, Dr. John Campbell. He became a lifelong mentor until he died last November. Eventually became the dean at the University of Illinois and president of Oklahoma State University. And then my very first month at the university as a freshman, I went to the Dairy Club, and the speaker that night was Dr. J.P. Everett, who had recently joined Ralston Purina in St. Louis as the manager of their research. I met him, and he never forgot me. He got an internship for me after I finished my undergraduate degree. After I finished my Ph.D., had a job waiting for me. It wasn't a done deal. I had some other interviews, too. And he also became a mentor of mine. When I was a senior at the University of Missouri, my professor arranged for me to meet with a professor from Cornell University who was on campus to make a presentation on growth and development and body composition across species, including humans. That's how I first met him, and that's how I got involved at Cornell University. So that's kind of a quick background. I did have 2 years in the Army. This was in the 60s or in Vietnam. The first year I spent in the Boston area at the Food and Nutrition Lab in a science and engineering program. But then I got pulled out of there and sent to Thailand, which was an equivalent of assignment to Vietnam or Korea. And interestingly, I wasn't trained for anything because I was in a science and engineering program. So they said, well, since you were in a food lab, we'll put you in food supply. Well, that was great at first.
Sure.
Yes, that was great at first because there were 2 lieutenants and a captain there. But within a couple of months, they rotated back, and we transitioned from a manual to a computerized system, and the whole thing crashed in a month. And so, again, I was blessed because when we ended up in the colonel's office, he said, what's the problem? I said, I don't know what I'm doing. And so he assigned this captain with an MBA from Berkeley to work with me, and I had a great learning experience and so on. So the other major event that occurred when I was an undergraduate is at that time there were very few women in agriculture. I knew one of them who also happened to be Catholic, and I called her for a date for an annual dance. She was unable to go, but then she said, I think I know somebody that might be interested, if you are interested. And I thought, well, okay, why not? That's how I met my wife, Molly, and next month will be our 50th wedding anniversary. We have been blessed with 4 children and 9 grandchildren. So that's a capsule of my life.
Congratulations. Wow, what a phenomenal story. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And I'm so glad you included the personal part there about your wife and your marriage, too. Thank you. Thank you very much. It sounds like you have had an illustrious career. And throughout your career, as you mentioned, there's been the providential hand of God.
Yes.
Between great parents, Catholic schools, good Catholic schools, the providential hand of God in terms of choosing your mentors, and helping you with the vocation of marriage as well, and choosing your spouse. So what a beautiful testament there. Throughout your career, you mentioned your work in animal husbandry, in nutrition science, and also that first presentation there for Cornell, how it included the human aspect as well. What can you say about the relationship between the industry or your work in dairy management and its relationship to human science?
Well, it's all science-based. It's a cow is a biological animal. The physiology, the biochemistry, those things are all the same across species. And a lot of the systems are similar. There are individual differences. A cow is a ruminant, has a big forestomach where rumen bacterial fermentation takes place, but I won't get into all of that. And I was blessed, too, because I had my professor at Cornell had a very strong scientific bent, let's say. That's an understatement. And he had a philosophy, and part of his philosophy was that if you had research funded by someone, some entity, some group, you had an obligation to publish that research because somebody invested in it. Another part of it was that scientists should not only expect critique, they should actively seek it. Now, that's very difficult because none of us like critique. But that helped me become a more critical scientist. Now, as far as the dairy cattle, one of the things that is similar is that reproductive technology was really commercialized with dairy cattle. In the 1940s, it began artificial insemination, and then later we got into embryos and creating in vitro fertilization. And so in a lot of cases, we don't ship cattle from the U.S. to other countries. We ship embryos, which are then implanted, and it avoids all the cost and the hassle of shipping live animals and all the issues related to that. So the whole area of cloning, of course, came out of animal research. Dolly the sheep is the most famous one. There's been work in cloning done at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So it's done in various species. And so I'm very attuned to that, understanding that while we have to be good stewards in how we treat animals, animals are not human beings. They don't have the inherent sanctity of life. They don't have a soul as we have. It still doesn't mean we mistreat animals. I would never advocate that. There are people, though, that feel, and organizations that feel that animals have rights equivalent, if not more so, than humans. The irony of it is, I found, and I know there's a thesis actually done at Oregon State University, is that unfortunately a lot of people who believe that strong in animal rights don't believe that much in human rights, including that of the unborn. So in many cases, they are ardent supporters of abortion. And so it's all part of the kind of our world has become more secularistic, more atheistic, and so the science has been pushed very strongly. But, if you look at the history of science, it's synonymous with the Catholic Church. It goes back into the Middle Ages when the Catholic Church had the monastery schools, and then later founded the university system. The oldest one is the University of Bologna, over 1,100 years old in Italy. So a lot of the key scientists in the 1500s, which are often called, before that, the Dark Ages, it wasn't the Dark Ages. It was, in terms of some aspects, with civilization, its survival, but it wasn't a Dark Ages from the standpoint of the Catholic Church. And the amount of scientific development that occurred, and I could go on quite a bit about what all happened, but the other element is
a really important distinction, and this is a distinction I've worked on before. Even just the point about the Dark Ages, in terms of Catholicism, in terms of the flowering of the intellectual Catholic tradition, as you say, the university system, the art, the literature, the sacred art, the sacred music, the polyphony. In terms of all of that, we were not experiencing a dark age. Yes, the planet was experiencing a dark age. Is civilization going to continue? We've got the bubonic plague. We've got all sorts of stuff happening. But the Catholicism and the scientific and intellectual tradition was flowering. It was just under the current. Correct?
Yes, and the Catholic Church also established really the first hospitals and mental institutions, orphanages, exploration of the world, advancement of philosophy, foundation of capitalistic economic theory, beautiful art, music, architecture, literature. The scientific method was actually developed. But a lot of that has been lost because, unfortunately, science, probably going back to the age of the Enlightenment, the 1800s, there was a separation of faith and reason, and it was called, ironically, the Age of Enlightenment. And it was that science would answer all the questions, all the issues. But science, while it can answer questions about what, it doesn't answer questions about why. Why was a human being created? How did this come about? And then one of the unfortunate downsides can happen to scientists is you have to have a strong drive and belief in science in order to be a good scientist. But the possible downside of that is you can separate yourself from any role of God in that world. And to a great extent that has happened. It doesn't have to happen, but it has happened. And the scientific method also involves critique and review. And in order to survive sometimes that critique, you have to stand on your own feet very strongly. But there's always the danger that you can believe that you're, omnipotent because you have all the answers when you believe strongly in what you're doing and why you're doing it. And then that can feed into atheism, like, okay, there really is no God. God doesn't have a role here. He doesn't fit here. And then you have people that come up with all sorts of rationales to why they don't believe in God. And sometimes you'll hear the word of Galileo, that he was persecuted and all that. That is a very complex situation. If you want to try something, just Google his name. I did that a couple months ago before a presentation, and I got over 20 million hits. That tells you how complex that whole situation is. There were personality issues.
Right.
Yeah, there were personality issues. He was not the most fun guy and all that sort of thing. So there's all sorts of things like that are too often
an oversimplification that has
absolutely
come down through the secular history.
Yes.
And unfortunately, most people don't delve deep enough to see that it was not, again, it was the same situation as with the Enlightenment. It was not that he was putting forward scientific observations and stating that they were scientific. He was putting forward scientific observations, and he was stating that they had theologic implications.
Yes,
that was when he stepped out of his realm as scientist. The church didn't have a problem with him as a scientist. They had a problem with him as a theologian. And similarly, in the world of the Enlightenment, it was a misnomer. It was, again, we are going to divorce science from faith, and we are going to create our own faith that is based only on science and push God to the periphery. And here we are now, centuries later, where we're reaping the fruit of pushing God to the periphery and pretending in all scientific hubris that science is God.
That's a good word, hubris. That's the potential downfall of scientists when they, push God out of the picture, even having a role. Because for me, the definition of science is simply a search for truth. Truth about what is in our world, what do we know, what can we found out about our world. And I think it was, who was it, St. Paul or somebody said, no, St. Augustine said that science and faith had the same author, God. So there cannot be a conflict between the two worlds. It's dependent on us how we look at it and how we deal with it. And, the other thing I find interesting is when I learn about scientists and that they were Catholic. And one of those I had an opportunity, it was probably 5-6 years ago now. I was in Eastern Europe. I was in the Czech Republic and Slovakia. The second largest city in the Czech Republic is Brno, Brno. It's a major university town. But its real claim to fame is it's the home of Gregor Mendel, the Augustinian head abbot who developed the laws of heritability in the 1800s through studies with garden peas. I actually had a chance to visit the monastery there, and they have a nice little museum, and it's on the main square, which is called Mendel Square. But Mendel was an amazing person to do these basic studies, and he actually published that work about 1865. But then it just never took hold, and it was sort of forgotten about, or some people never knew it, until the early 1900s, when these studies were rediscovered and independently verified. And as a scientist, as well as a priest, Mendel had all kinds of interest. He was trying to figure out how the genetics of bees, and he didn't quite figure it out, though. He also studied climate. And then one of those fascinating things I found out was his physics professor, when he was in college, was Austrian physicist Christian Doppler, who proposed in 1842 what has become known as the Doppler effect, or radar.
Sure.
It's just amazing.
I had no idea that Mendel and Doppler had worked together.
Yeah, well, he was Mendel was a student at Doppler, so I don't know if they actually ended up working together, but certainly that had something to do with his formation as a scientist.
That is
very
interesting.
There's all kinds of other Catholic scientists. René, not good at French, Descartes, who was the father of philosophy. The modern adding machine was Blaise Pascal. Of course, I deal with the dairy industry, and one of the main factors in the dairy industry is pasteurization, which was not completely sterilization. It kills most of the bacteria and prevents, harmful growth and so on. So Louis Pasteur was the founder of microbiology, and he discovered pasteurization in 1864. It's considered one of the top 10 scientific discoveries in the area of food science. He also created the first vaccine for rabies and anthrax. And on his tomb, there's this quote. It says, "Happy the man who bears within him a divinity, an ideal of beauty and obeys it, an ideal of art, an ideal of science, an ideal of country, an ideal of the virtues of the gospel." And then more recently,
that's a beautiful quote. He was a devout Catholic and a proponent of the Rosary. That Rosary
I didn't know that
in
part.
his hand.
Yeah.
He was Our Lady had her mantle around his shoulders, and he knew it, and promoted the Rosary.
Another more recent scientist is a Catholic priest. A previous Catholic priest was Father Nicholas Copernicus, who discovered that the Earth revolved around the sun. But in this past century, it was Father Georges Lemaitre, a Belgian priest. His contribution was to the general theory of relativity, cosmology, was his hypothesis of the expanding universe in 1927, and is the founder of the Big Bang Theory in 1931. I tell people that's not the TV program Big Bang, that's the real world thing. And from 1960 until his death, he was chairman of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, where he'd been a member since 1931. He was also evidently connected with Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein had pictures of three men on his wall. Michael Faraday, famous for electromagnetism and electrochemistry, physics. James Maxwell, another famous electromagnetic physicist. And Sir Isaac Newton, the man who discovered gravity. All three Catholics.
Wow.
Alexander Fleming, who invented penicillin, a devout Catholic. So there's all this history that very few people are aware of anymore.
That is a really important point. Much of what you said I'd never heard of either. And it's not something that our young people are hearing. They're hearing from the popular media, the Catholic Church, outdated, outmoded, anti-science, old-fashioned, and they're hearing that there is a tension between faith and science, and that faith is nothing more than superstition. And nothing could be further from the truth. But if they don't hear the truth to be able to discern reality, the message that they're given is something that it becomes inculcated. And I'm so grateful that you're here today to help dispel these myths.
And there are studies that show that young people, as young as 10 to 12 years old, all the way up to about maybe 25, this is the message they're hearing from the world, that there's this conflict. And so that means they're very vulnerable to losing their faith because of that. There are several studies I can cite that have looked at that. And here's a direct quote from one of those studies that was featured in an article in our Sunday Visitor in 2016. And this young person, I don't know if a man or woman, says, "I realize that religion is in complete contradiction with the rational and scientific world, and to continue to subscribe to a religion would be hypocritical." So that shows you how it has grabbed people, young people. And again, part of this comes back to what has been called scientism, which is almost like a religion. It's a belief that science can answer all the questions. Not only can it answer all the questions, but we should fully fund it to answer any and all questions, not limited by necessarily ethical or moral issues.
That's an excellent point. We have this new scientism that is itself a religion, and it is the belief that science can answer all the questions. Not only can science answer all the questions, but science should pose the questions that are answered, and that we should all fund it.
And we had an example of how this could go awry in Missouri in 2006. There are two major research institutions. One's the Stowers Research Institute in Kansas City, and another one is Washington University Biomedical Program in St. Louis. And those two organizations wanted to do embryonic stem cell research. And at that time, that was really hyped, that was the solution to all kinds of diseases and problems, medical problems we have. But they felt that the political climate wasn't very good for that, so they decided what they should do is to create a constitutional amendment that would allow embryonic stem cell research. But they realized that it wouldn't fly well, so what they did was they created an amendment which on the face of it claimed to ban human cloning. And so that grabbed a lot of people's attention, and they spent over $30 million in this state to try to get that passed. And as we dug into it, we found out, well, there's much more to it. And the only avenue we had to oppose it was grassroots. Eventually, what became a 3-1 margin that was going to pass barely passed because people found out more about it. And the things they found out about it was, well, the ballot initiative just had a short paragraph. In the background information that was submitted that most voters never read, it defined, or I should say it redefined human cloning. It said human cloning only occurred when a clone was created, was implanted, went through gestation or pregnancy, and resulted in a live birth. So you could create a live birth. You could create a human clone, and at any stage before live birth, if you killed it, it was sanctioned by this amendment. But the voters generally didn't.
You could create a live clone. You could have that clone gestate, a human clone, all the way up to 40 weeks, inject its heart with potassium and kill it right before birth, deliver it deceased, use its organs for whatever, use its tissues for whatever. It's a clone. It's a clone that has gestated for 40 weeks, and it would be considered perfectly legal under this bill. Not only legal, but sanctioned, because it did not meet the narrow definition of cloning, which included the live birth.
And that is in the Missouri Constitution. That is allowed because while it barely passed, it did pass, but it didn't remove the uncertainty because people learned more about it and voted against it. And then some of this language is incredibly diabolical. It said that, if there was a lawsuit, it had to be in the location where the institution was. It limited any damages to $25,000. Like for women being superovulated to provide the eggs for the cloning.
Wow.
It used language that was dehumanizing. It would not say an embryo. It would not use that term. It would not say even a fetus. It wouldn't use any of that language. And in fact, major people from each of the two organizations I mentioned authored a letter to the journal Science in which they said, here's the kind of language we should use so it does not confuse people. Well, actually, it was meant in a sense to confuse people so they didn't really understand what was going on. And what they wanted, of course...
Deliberate.
Yes, and it said it in the letter.
It's deliberate deception.
Yes. And in general, these are good people. They just got off track because they saw this new frontier of biological science called embryonic stem cell research. And so they created all this hype that it would cure all these diseases and really soon. Others, had some question. There are some Stanford bioethicists at the time that had an article or short article in the journal Science that said, this is not good because it's creating undue hope. And if there's any solutions, they're way down the road because they're not even close to clinical trials at that stage. And, of course, the reason...
This program was deliberately set out $30 million to bamboozle the voters, to make them believe that they were voting for a bill that would outlaw human cloning, when in fact they were voting for the opposite. They were voting for a bill that would not only allow but promote cloning up to the moment of birth. And
the reason
that the language that was used was purposely deceptive to make people believe that this was not human.
And
words
the
like
reason
embryo, words like fetus.
Right. And the reason they did that was because they did market research and they found out that when they said a human clone, people thought of a born person. So that's why they backed it all the way up, and why they didn't use the word embryo. They used the word blastocyst. Well, that's at day 7 or 8. And the reason they needed to create the clones is because they wanted the embryonic stem cells before they differentiated into all the tissues in the body. But when you extract those cells, that kills the embryo. So they had to create this whole storyline that people would accept. And exit polls found that the majority of the people who voted for the amendment did so because they believed it opposed human cloning.
Unbelievable. Absolutely deceptive and purposely deceptive. And one of the other points that you brought out was that there are good people involved. But again, it's the utilitarian consequentialism, the holding over them this belief that we're going to cure everything. We're going to cure Alzheimer's. We're going to cure all forms of cancer. We're going to do this great good. So we will swallow our ethics and be deceptive because we're focused on this end. We've seen it in the Tuskegee syphilis study. We've seen it in the Nuremberg trials.
Yes.
We've seen it throughout all of the most egregious bioethical issues where there are really, really good people involved, highly trained scientists, highly respected scientists, administrators that ordinarily you would not question their ethics, and yet they're led astray, which is terrifying because it makes each of us look in the mirror and say, wow, that could be me, could it? It is a phenomena that we've seen throughout all of bioethics. And I'm sorry for interrupting you. Keep going.
Well, that's the most egregious example I can think of. As a scientist, I know there are other areas where science has been led astray because you've had some unethical decisions made. And one of I'm most familiar with is because of the area that I practice science in, is with a scientist named Ancel Keys. Don't know that many people have heard of him because he was a medical professor at the University of Minnesota and did some good work during World War II and post-World War II in Europe with malnutrition. And so what he ended up doing, he had access to a lot of databases. And around, I'm trying to think of what year that was, about 1950, let me see, I've got a paper right in front of me if I can find that. Around 1950, he came up with this theory of diet related to cardiovascular disease. And what he did was he had data from like 22 countries, but he selected only 7 countries to create a graph and showing that dietary fat, for instance, primarily saturated fat, increased cardiovascular disease. And that became the impetus for a lot of studies done where they looked at saturated versus unsaturated fatty acids, the level of fat in diets, and the whole cholesterol theory and so on. We're talking about 50 years of work. Now, in the earlier years, some scientists picked up on this and called attention to it, but nobody really paid attention to it, that he had selected a limited data set out of all the data that was available. And so it was only more recently, in the last, say, 20 years or so, 1953 was when he first published that. And then there was some critique in 1957 and so on. So people started going back and re-looking at the data and started looking at studies more closely, and they found out, well, it wasn't nearly that simple. In fact, in a lot of cases, the relationship didn't hold up at all because he ignored data that didn't fit his theory. There's an author, Nina Teichholz, T-E-I-C-H-O-L-Z. She has a website. She spent 10 years researching this whole subject area and several years ago published a book called The Big Fat Surprise, a catchy title. And she documents all of this that happened. Well, the unfortunate side effect of this was that if you lower fat in diets, and this sounds counterintuitive, that, if there's a problem with fat in diet, you should lower the fat. But what happens is when you lower the fat in the diet, something else takes its place. And for the most part,
sure.
that ended up being starch and sugars. And that ends up, in many cases, resulting in obesity and type 2 diabetes. So it spawned this whole episode that we're still dealing with. And then, again, the unfortunate part about that is that becomes the accepted dogma in the medical community and practice. And it takes maybe 1 or 2 generations for that to come back into perspective with the newer information. In fact, that still hasn't been reflected very well in the dietary guidelines. Now, next year, in 2020, those dietary guidelines are up for review, so we'll see how much of that comes in the picture. And I don't completely fault the medical community, because when something becomes accepted, we know that they have malpractice suits facing them. And so if you don't follow what's accepted dogma, then you're opening yourself up to lawsuits. And in fact, I heard
practice guidelines, and it is the way the system reimburses, the way the system protects itself. You've got practice guidelines, and if you have a physician who is not practicing according to community standards via the practice guidelines, then he is open to liability, and he's open the clinic that he works for to liability. But when those practice guidelines are based on erroneous data, it affects everybody.
It does, and this author, I heard a webinar she gave, and she got a number of questions, and one of them was this very question, and she said when she's talked to doctors, they say, well, we really don't feel like we can change our recommendation right now. And then you get these drugs that are developed to treat that, to lower blood cholesterol, whatever. Well, blood cholesterol is highly genetically related. I know that because my family has a history of that. Both sides of my families live in their 80s and 90s, except my mother died in her 70s from ALS. And when we reach age 50, all of a sudden our blood cholesterol, total cholesterol, the low-density lipoproteins spike. Mine runs 250 to 270. And so then they want to treat that with a statin. Well, I don't have any family history. I have no risk factors. So it's sort of like, well, what's the side effects of that? You know, there can be side effects like muscle pain or liver damage. And so that's what she said. She found that the medical community kind of gets stuck in that. She wrote an article for a British medical journal about her book and his findings. And they received a number of complaints, and so much so that they felt the need to investigate this. And so they spent a year investigating her article and whether it was well-founded or not, because the medical community largely didn't accept it. And they found out, yes, it's well-founded, and they stuck by it.
Really?
But these things take time to work through because, you know, in our world saturated with information, it's often hard for non-scientists or even non-practicing scientists to sort through all of this. And, you know, science really makes progress by disproving. Yeah.
Right. It's easier to turn around a PT boat than it is to turn around an aircraft carrier. And when everybody's jumped on the aircraft carrier of cholesterol and animal fat and statin, and it becomes ingrained, this is it. This is what the science, we've seen it with oat bran, we've seen it with vitamin D3, that there will be studies that point in a certain direction, and suddenly whatever that direction is, it becomes the direction for everything.
Well, one of my favorite stories about this and the importance of trying to disprove theories goes back a number of years ago. I think it's in the early 80s. Two Australian scientists felt that there was the currently accepted theory about stomach ulcers was not correct. And so what they did was, Barry Marshall was named one, and I think Robert Warren the other one. They felt it was a bacterium, and it's Helicobacter pylori is the name of it. And they really couldn't get any of the community to accept that because the accepted idea was due to stress or spicy foods and that sort of thing. So one of them dosed himself with that bacteria and created a stomach ulcer, and then ended up treating himself with the antibiotic and curing the ulcer. And when they submitted their paper, it was rejected, and it was really rated quite lowly. And then about 25 years later, the two of them received the Nobel Prize for their work. But it was totally against the grain. And so in that case, you can see why scientists have to have a strong belief and a strong approach in what they do. And it can be very beneficial when that happens. But in other cases, it might not be beneficial.
And at that point, we were looking at egos and
Yes.
science. And now
Yes.
we're talking about an entire funding machine with NIH grants and careers being built on certain presumptions. And because of the way the funding machine works, voices that go against the grain are squelched. When you follow the money, voices are squelched. It makes it very difficult to arrive at the truth scientifically. And that brings us full circle to the relationship between faith and science, faith and reason. Pope St. John Paul's beautiful encyclical Fides et Ratio, wonderful starting place regarding the distinction between faith and reason and how they are two wings of the same creature. One of the questions I always ask Dr. Kertz, because this program is through WCAT, through Holy Apostles College and Seminary, and we do have men in formation who are listening, as well as their formators, priests. What would you say to men in formation, to their preceptors, to their formators, to their bishops, regarding faith and reason and how best to help those under their care, under their formation, to navigate this difficult topic?
That's a critical question. There's a couple dimensions to that. One is I would point out there's an organization called ITEST, Institute for Theological Encounter with Science and Technology, that was founded here in St. Louis by a Jesuit physicist at St. Louis University and a biochemist, to really address this very issue, and it's now approaching its 50th anniversary. There's another Jesuit, Father Robert Spitzer, who's a physicist. He's been president of Gonzaga University. He has a website really devoted to this very topic, and the name of that is Magiscenter, Magiscenter. And they have programs they're developing for young people and for curriculum at high school level. And ITEST has also developed a program for the elementary school level. So we need to have more, I should say, better scientific education. The difficulty is, if you're not a scientist, how do you sort through these issues? Well, you really need to be somewhat skeptical. Unfortunately, when somebody says, well, 95% of the scientists in the world agree on this, a lot of people will find that very convincing, but I find that's a red flag. Because when everybody thinks the same way, there's not much thinking going on. It's a group thinking process. So then you should pay attention. Yes, you should pay attention to people who are saying, now wait a minute, there's some aspects of this that doesn't make sense, that doesn't tie together, that doesn't fit. So what's that telling us? Another thing I find disconcerting, to say the least, is when I read articles, in a magazine or in a newspaper, and they'll say this study showed a 20% reduction in such and such, or a 20% increase, and they'll never give the numbers. So is it 20% of 0.01, or is it 20% of 100? You can read entire articles, and again,
pay attention to the end, the number. Yes,
the numbers. So when you read something, look for the numbers, not just the percentages. In fact, the percentages by themselves can be highly misleading, because if you got a very small number to begin with and it increases 50%, that may not mean much of anything. And so, for seminarians, I'm saying, you have to have an eye and an ear on the world around you and what's coming out of science, and be critical in what you read, what you think, and what you say. And you may have to search out some sources, some different sources. What I find interesting is, in a number of cases, the young men coming through the seminary are not coming right out of college, or if they are, they have a background in science or engineering. So they have a natural foundation for that. We had a seminarian that ordained a priest in our parish who has degrees, I believe, in chemistry and engineering. So then they need to use that not only within their own circle, but to enlarge their circle to reach their fellow seminarians or fellow priests.
That's an excellent point. One of the other points that you had made privately when we were doing a pre-interview, in terms of the situation in 2006 with regard to the bill that was deceptively marketed and titled. When your archbishop at the time was invited on a program to debate the bill, he sought you out as a member of the Catholic Conference. He sought out an expert to speak and to debate, and I thought that was brilliant. He knew that as an archbishop, he was being backed into a corner and was to be used by the media machine, and he didn't fall for it. And instead, he found you, knowing Magisterium-faithful Catholic, excellent credentials, well-known scientist, knows this material. I'm going to have him speak. And can you speak more to that? But I thought that was brilliant, and I thought for these young men, when they have a microphone pushed at them, when they have someone who's asking for a sound bite that is going to be used, to know, you know what, let me take a look at this and let me find someone who can speak to this with me. But can you mention how that all happened?
Well, it happened because after I got my Ph.D. and moved to St. Louis, it was in 1973, and of course you had the whole Roe versus Wade and Doe versus Bolton. The second one of those two decisions is generally ignored by the media because it doesn't fit their picture. But I saw through that whole business about, it's just a bunch of cells, it's a fetus, or it's an embryo, so it's not a human being. I knew that was life because of the cattle business. We have the same biology. So I knew that. So my wife and I got more involved in that. She eventually became the director for the pro-life program in the Archdiocese of St. Louis, and she worked with Cardinal Burke. I had originally been appointed by the Missouri Catholic Conference by the previous Archbishop, who later became Cardinal Regali. So that's how I became acquainted with Archbishop Burke when he came. We had a common background. He grew up on a dairy farm, and I did too. So he knew about my understanding in this area, and that's why he asked me to go. Now, I had a big lump in my throat because I was up against a crusty local TV program, and I was up against Senator John Danforth, who was a spokesman for the program. But I had some background on it, and so I was able to stick to the science side of it. And that's when I found out, too, that, that they wouldn't use any terms like embryo. They would use the term blastocyst, and then it's as small as the end of a pencil, and would you save blastocyst or would you save a 3-year-old? And I'd say, well, it's a matter of triage. You try to save all of them. They're all human life, just different stages. So I think that's a good point, too. In fact, I'm going to be involved with a program at a parish in our archdiocese where the local pastor has worked with iTest. He has several scientists who will be on the program from his parish. And that's the other thing, is to localize as much as possible. So I'm going to be there and try to be as helpful as I can as a background or a reference source in this area.
You raise another point too, and we're almost running out of time. But throughout this program, over the many months that we've been doing Inter Vitam et Mortem, the concept of the Holy Spirit and discerning, and being willing to do whatever the Holy Spirit asks you to do for the church, even when it's outside your comfort zone. And here you are in 2006. The last thing on earth you wanted to do was go on that program and go toe-to-toe with that TV personality and with the senator. And yet you were asked to do it. It was outside your comfort zone, but you knew it was the right thing to do, and you did it. And I wasn't alone. There were a number of other scientists and medical people, including some from Washington University, their own university, who spoke out about this and made presentations. And the interesting thing is the proponents would back down. They wouldn't do debates. They wouldn't do interviews because they didn't have the truth, the message. St. Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, Carmelite, has said, those who seek truth ultimately are seeking and will find God. She had lost her Jewish faith and become agnostic. And It was in seeking the truth, philosophically, intellectually, and finally theologically, that she found God. For those of us who are asked, particularly in the pro-life movement, in science, in ethics, to speak, because those that we're defending don't have a voice. They're the tiniest and most vulnerable, made in the image and likeness of God. They don't have a voice. When we're being asked to speak, we've got to. And I'm so grateful that you came on this program today. We are absolutely at the end of our time again, but I really want to thank you for being here on WCAT, Inter Vitam et Mortem. Thank you, Dr. Al Kertz. Thank you for the work that you do and the witness that you've given. And I hope you're willing to come back and do this again, because we've just scratched the surface. There's a lot more I'd really love to talk to you about.
Yes, I appreciate the opportunity. I feel like my life has a purpose and a reason, and I'm here for this purpose and for this reason.
Well, thank you so much. Let's do, as we're close to out of time, and we've done, we usually close with a longer prayer, but let's just do in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Glory be to the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and will be forever unto the ages of ages. Amen. Thank you so much.
All right.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.